Welcome to the LLG podcast. I'm Deborah Evans, LLG's Chief Executive, and I'm joined today by Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
Now, we are back following a hugely successful Monitoring Officers Conference last Friday in London, where we heard from a number of speakers on the practical concerns for monitoring officers and also how to deploy the wider skills needed to get the job done. As Doreen Forrester-Brown reminded us, the legal knowledge is a given, it's expected, it's the wider strategic leadership which needs to be demonstrated. Now, as promised last week, the Grenfell Tower Report is of particular significance to the sector, and while shocking, it's important we don't just shake our heads at the appalling range of failures, but instead really examine what went wrong, learn from this, and employ safeguards through governance, oversight, and culture to ensure history is not repeated. So, Dennis, explain how we will break down the report in the podcast this week.
Thank you, Deborah. The podcast will look at four important areas covered by the report. First, we will summarize the report's main findings, in particular relating to the contractors involved in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. Then, we will look at the role of central government and what the report had to say about government ministers and officials. We will then examine the findings in relation to the regulation of construction industry products. And finally, we will look at the recommendations made by the report.
Sounds good, Dennis, and I know there is specific reference for local authorities in those recommendations, which we will come to.
Yes, there is. But first, let's begin with that overview. As we speak, the police are under pressure to accelerate the criminal investigation into the Grenfell Tower fire after an excoriating report found that companies operated with systematic dishonesty and that all 72 deaths at Grenfell Tower were entirely avoidable. A 7-year public inquiry culminated in a report on the 4th of September that laid bare decades of failure by central government and egregious behaviour by a string of multi-million-dollar firms involved in the tower's disastrous refurbishment. Sir Martin Moore-Bick, who led the inquiry, found that firms which made the combustible materials used on the tower, Arconic, Celotex and Kingspan, all engaged in deliberate and sustained strategies to mislead the market. He identified incompetence, cavalier attitudes and concealment of wrongdoing, while Grenfell residents' safety concerns were dismissed by their local authority and their landlord. The inquiry also found that Ryden, the main contractor for the refurbishment, displayed a casual attitude to fire safety and bears considerable responsibility for the fire. And another company, Harley Facades, which installed the lethal cladding system on the building, also bears a significant degree of responsibility for the fire because it assumed that others would check that it was safe. And architects, Studio E, also demonstrated, according to the report, a cavalier attitude also to the regulations affecting fire safety, and also bears a significant degree of responsibility for the disaster. There was also significant criticism of the local authority leaders, and the inquiry concluded that financial considerations had driven key decisions involved in the refurbishment. And there's more detail on that aspect in the accompanying blog. Deborah.
Yes, Dennis and I will be discussing the drivers for the local government decision-making in regard to Grenfell in the vlog. But for now, I want to look at the roles central government played. The report also has a lot to say about the role of government officials and government ministers. The report says that officials and some ministers in the local government department were defensive and dismissive when MPs raised concerns about the fire safety of cladding before Grenfell. And this was despite the 2009 Lacarnal house fire in Camberwell, South London, where cladding had burned and 6 people had died previously. So there was some history which should have concentrated the minds. The inquiry found that the government's deregulation agenda had dominated the department's thinking to such an extent that even matters affecting fire safety were ignored, delayed or disregarded. But the report says that the problems in central government went back even further, as far as a cladding fire at Knowsley Heights in Liverpool in 1991. The Labour government did not heed a warning from the Environment and Transport Select Committee in 1999, and the government also failed to pay due regard to the results of a large-scale cladding test in 2001 involving aluminium cladding which burned violently. The report goes on to say that by 2012, after more cladding fires around the world, the government knew that the building regulations guidance on fire were unclear and not properly understood by many in the industry. The report says that the responsible government department was poorly run, with inadequate oversight on these important matters. It's amazing actually to think, Dennis, that despite all these events, warnings and evidence in existence, no one sat up and did anything.
Well, that's right, Deborah. And it was compounded by failures across all the participants, because the remaining part of the jigsaw of responsibility involves the construction industry itself. And my summary on this follows. Turning now to the regulation of the construction industry, a number of serious criticisms were aimed at the bodies who approve the use of building materials, and in particular, the British Board of Agreement and the Building Research Establishment. And according to the report, the work of the Building Research Establishment, which was involved in checking the insulation provided by Celotex and Kingspan, the contractors providing the materials, and was marred by unprofessional conduct, inadequate practices, a lack of effective oversight, poor reporting, and a poor lack of scientific rigor. And the report says that the fact that the contractors were able to obtain misleading certificates relating to their products is evidence of a serious failure of the approval system and points to a need for an entirely different approach. The report says that it wants a regulator to be responsible for assessing the conformity of construction products with laws, regulations, and industry norms, and for that body to issue those approval certificates. And concluding on this, one of the reasons the Grenfell disaster happened was, according to the report, that building regulations were entirely unclear. The inquiry chair said that guidance on how to meet the fire section of the regulations did not provide the information needed to design buildings that are safe in fire. And he recommended a review and amendments annually and promptly. Deborah.
There are, Dennis, other areas of the report which we haven't covered in the podcast, notably that pertaining to the response by the London Fire Brigade and emergency services. The direction to advise residents to stay in the flats was particularly examined. However, it's important to note that the report also marked out fire officers and emergency services for their courage and devotion to duty. One cannot imagine having to go into a burning building in the way that they did and deal with the distress and panic that followed. But let's turn to those recommendations we mentioned earlier. There were many recommendations made in the report, and we highlight just a few here. So the report recommends the drawing together of all the functions relating to the construction industry under a single regulator and bringing responsibility for the functions relating to fire safety into one department under a single Secretary of State. The report also says the government should appoint a chief construction advisor to provide advice on all matters affecting the construction industry and an independent panel to consider whether it is in the public interest for building control functions to be performed by those with a commercial interest in the process. Some recommendations are specific to local authorities, however, and what are they, Dennis?
Well, yes, in relation to training, all employees, including chief executives, should have training to ensure they have regard to resilience as an integral part of their responsibilities. Local authorities should draw up contingency plans that are reasonably practicable for enabling people to be placed in temporary accommodation at short notice and in a way that meets their personal, religious, and cultural requirements. Plans should also include arrangements for providing immediate financial assistance for people affected by an emergency. And the report says there should be plans for responding to emergencies and arrangements for providing information to the public by whatever methods of communication that are likely to be most effective. Now, the report also recommends a review of the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, which sets out a framework for emergency preparedness in the UK, and local resilience forums should adopt national standards to ensure effective training, preparation, and planning for emergencies. Now, regarding the regulation of social housing providers, however, the inquiry declined to make any firm recommendations. Since the fire occurred, Parliament has already enacted the Social Housing Regulation Act 2023, and this enables the regulator of social housing to play a more active role in setting appropriate standards and ensuring that they are met. And for this reason, the inquiry did not consider it necessary to make any additional recommendations in relation to the matters that were uncovered.
Now, there's plenty for the sector to consider, Dennis, but where ethical governance is at the forefront of everyone's minds and where a culture exists for open challenge without recrimination, good decision-making should prevail. Now, in this edition of the LLG vlog, we take a specific look at the failings in the tenancy management organisation relating to Grenfell, so do join us for that. And on that note, you can read more on the items discussed today and many, many more besides by going to Bulletin 33 for the Grenfell reports and also Bulletin 34 available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Goodbye.